Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Laura Marling called Semper Femina. So I'll admit I was pretty slow to the punch to cover Laura Marling's last album, Short Movie, back in 2015. There was a lengthy back catalog to listen through and decode, mostly because Marling's exploration of themes and ideas reflected wisdom and nuance far beyond her years. She's my age. And despite being transitional and what I would argue is a slightly lesser entry in her discography, there was still a lot to discuss and untangle there. But again, it was transitional in every sense of the word. Not only did it feel like a stylistic shift away from her acoustic sound to add more electric distortion, albeit feeling a little bit listless at points, thematically it was tracing different directions too. This was a record that was partially inspired by her move to Los Angeles, and the mingled desires for companionship and lonely purity that ran through that album, all of it led to a record that I liked but didn't really love. And while there were a few standouts that I do revisit to this day, it's not really a record that I return to very often, especially in comparison with the rest of her discography. And believe it or not, while most critics were a bit warmer on it than I was, they tended to fall into similar opinions that it was a bit of a lesser entry in her discography compared to albums like I Speak Because I Can or Once I Was an Eagle. Not so this time around. In fact, the critical acclaim that Laura Marling has received for her exploration of definitions of femininity, that's been considerable with this record. Not that I'm entirely surprised here though. Laura Marling has been a critical darling for some time. Deservedly so, I should add. She's a great songwriter, but there's also a pretty significant subset of well-meaning critics that'll throw praise to the exploration of specific themes without really touching on whether or not they're done well. Now, again, it's Laura Marling. She's got the sort of insight and tact that can lead to some brilliant songwriting, and especially coming after Short Movie, I was curious how she was going to evolve and improve her sound. So, okay, what do we get with Semper Femina? Well, it was a fascinating listen, and just like all of her albums, it required a fair bit for me to really decode it, but it also fell into a perplexing spot that I'm not sure works all the way through. Again, just like her last album, conceptually there's a lot to really appreciate, but it feels like a record trying to marry a few ideas that I don't think completely work in the lyrics, all against instrumentation that might feel like a more defined fusion of acoustic and electric than on Short Movie, but it also lacks the urgency and standout hooks for me. So bear with me, folks, this might take a little bit to explain, but overall, another good record, but not really a great one in my book. And to start, well, hell, we gotta start with Laura Marling herself, because you all know she's one hell of a singer. Clear and balanced tones, capable of dipping into a lower sing-talk register, where she can swear freely, or slipping into her upper register for fluttery high notes to end off a song, for example. She's received comparisons to Joni Mitchell throughout her entire career, and I could listen to her voice all damn day, especially when the carefully arranged multi-tracking is on point and she does get a little bit feistier, which unfortunately doesn't show up often enough on this record, but on tracks like Wildfire, it's certainly welcome. I definitely like that sort of sound for her. But what exactly is she singing about this time? Well, if you read between the lines on Soothing, it seems almost like a rejection of sexual advances from a certain hopeless wanderer, of which I sincerely hope that's an intentional reference given Marling's past, but really it rings as a larger than this, the rejection of a certain male gaze that only serves to consume or control or dominate. But then Laura Marling does something kind of interesting. According to an interview with Fader, she began writing this album from the perspective of a guy writing about women, only to come to the realization that more often than not, these were her own emotions rooted in a lot of her own passions, and that she didn't really need to justify them as one sex or the other. And while this did lead for a lot of critics to start questioning her own sexuality, I'm not really sure that's appropriate or even necessary here. You could easily see the messages of misconnections, broken relationships, apologies that ring kind of hollow, and questions whether or not her difficulties make her less worthy of love as platonic rather than romantic there. And while sexuality does not go unstated, it's not the primary driving force behind this album. Of course, it's all pretty oblique. A girl is only named on Nouel, which is arguably the thesis point of this album, and in the meantime, the usage of a lot of pronouns means that it can be kind of tough to trace the through line of a lot of the stories that Marling is looking to tell, which I think might be part of the point. These are intended to be framed as universal stories, even down to the lines emphasizing and reclaiming Virgil's old declaration of Semper Femina, owning that fickle and transitive property that's no less potent potent and intrinsic to being feminine, at least in her point of view. And honestly, I'm kind of conflicted about this, most because I think there's a false equivalency being drawn between the passion on this album and actual love that I think is a frustrating misstep that kind of undercuts the entire record's theme. Now take for example, on the song The Valley, Laura Marling says, "We love beauty cause it needs us to," which implies beauty, and by extension passion. A lot of the value there is because it's short, it won't always last, which was very similar to White Lung's thesis on Below last year, a song I really do love and something I do agree with. But love? Love extends longer than that. It means more than that. A very different sort of transcendence compared to raw but fleeting passion. And more often than not, because of the lack of specifics and the details on this album, I got the uneasy impression that I was getting excuses for capriciousness that was being equated as love. I understand and appreciate claiming agency for passion or lack thereof, and its consequences on songs like Wild Once or Nouel or The Next Time. But by avoiding the details of these connections, it runs the risk of feeling just as detached as the male gaze can be. And I know that's not Laura Marling's intent, but that comes through in a lot of the writing there. Like, maybe the problem is that the instrumentation and production didn't really stand out for me as much as I wanted it to. Putting aside the little irony that all of Marling's backing band and her producer, Blake Mills, they're men, not women, this record decidedly feels more deliberate and reserved than the rougher aggression that underscored a lot of short movies, particularly in some of the songs I liked. Now, that's not saying there isn't tension on songs like Soothing thanks to the sharp, brittle percussion and the bass melody, or that there isn't beauty on songs like The Valley with its string section, or the choppy edge of Wildfire, or the primarily acoustic Nouel. But I do think some of the electric integration here is a little bit shaky, like the fuzz that lurks behind the bridge of Next Time, or the main electric lines that run through Don't Pass Me By against the fizzy beat, or Nothing Not Nearly that's a little bit more aggressive, probably the most bombastic song here. It's not bad production, mind you, but it doesn't quite feel as well blended and balanced as it should. But beyond that, Marling herself has even said that she was aiming to focus more on lyrics, so she opted for slightly more simple arrangements here. And I gotta say, kind of shows. Not that the melodies are bad, but I don't find the hooks as immediate or interesting, presuming that we get hooks at all. And I have to question why Blake Mills didn't do more beyond some very tasteful string sections to augment these hooks. He's not a bad producer given his discography, but I don't find him particularly interesting either. And on a record like this, it could have afforded some composition or production risks that I'm not sure we got. But as a whole, I referenced White Lung earlier, but the record that Laura Marling's Semper Femina reminds me a lot more of is A Seat at the Table by Solange Knowles. Potent themes, a couple utterly gorgeous moments, but also maybe a little too reserved and underwritten to convey the bigger ideas that lie beneath it effectively. And yeah, like that album, I can see Semper Femina resonating a lot more with a different audience, in this case women, than it would with most guys. And I can accept that it's not for me. But as I've said countless times in the past, the truly great material in this vein can transcend that and speak to the experience in a way that can connect with anybody. And by playing to broader universality in the lack of detail in the writing, I'd argue that Laura Marling blurs an otherwise potent message. I get being cryptic and poetic, but if you want to avoid conflation in this territory, you gotta be a little more clear, you gotta bring more detail. That said, I'm still giving this a solid 7 out of 10. It's a damn good record from a ridiculously talented performer that I respect tremendously. Again, I can listen to this album very easily. I just wish that I liked it a lot more, or that I loved it instead of just liking it. That's all. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine my opinion on this might ring as a bit controversial, but hey, I really wanted to love this, but it just wasn't gripping me as much as I wanted it to. So yeah, if you want to buy the album, links in the description below, and the poll's up there for all you to tell me how wrong I am. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, or perhaps more, and once a week you guys get the higher Patreon contributors get to add records or even movies to my schedule. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.